Silas McRae built an empire with precision, Dante Holloway betrayed it for power, and Ramona Cruz watched it all burn. Now, the streets bleed under the shadow of America's most ruthless gang war. In the decaying outskirts of Detroit, where factories stood hollow and entire blocks were swallowed by silence, a new force began to rise. It wasn't loud or obvious at first. It crept in slowly, like rot beneath a floorboard, unnoticed until the damage was irreversible. The Crimson Vultures, a gang born out of desperation and discipline through cities, emerged as a silent revolution in the city's darkest corners. The streets were already familiar with violence, but this gang brought something different: order within chaos. At the center of it all was Silas, Bloodhawk, McRae. Silas wasn't just another street thug. He was a former army tactician, dishonorably discharged after a mission in Afghanistan went catastrophically wrong. The details were buried, but whispers followed him. Ruthless, calculated, cold. When he returned to Detroit, he found a city as broken as the system he once served. Instead of disappearing into the shadows like many ex-soldiers, he found purpose in power. He built the Crimson Vultures with a soldier's discipline and a warlord's ambition. Silas started small, organizing corner dealers, uniting scattered crews, offering protection in exchange for loyalty. But unlike traditional gangs, he didn't reward aggression without thought. He watched, calculated, and selected lieutenants not based on brutality, but efficiency. Among them were two names that would become legends in their own right: Dante, Smoke, Holloway, and Ramona, Steel, Cruz. Dante was the street smart hustler who understood the flow of money and product better than anyone. He spoke the language of every crew in Detroit, moved like smoke through the Allies and nightclubs, and never left a trace. Ramona was the opposite: silent, calculating, and dangerous in a way that didn't need explanation. She didn't raise her voice or make threats. Her presence alone was enough. A former boxer turned enforcer. Her fists did the talking, and few survived to retell it. Under Silas's leadership, the Crimson Vultures began to reshape the city. They weren't interested in flashy displays or territorial graffiti. Instead, they marked their presence with silence. Drug corners operated without police interference. Gun shipments moved through abandoned buildings like ghosts. Surveillance footage was always missing. Witnesses disappeared before trials. Informants found dead before they could speak. Silas's rule was absolute, enforced not by fear alone, but by precision. But what set the Vultures apart wasn't just their grip on the streets. It was their method of expansion. They didn't wait for wars to happen. They prevented them. Silas sent emissaries into neighboring territories with offers: join or vanish. Most chose to join. Those who didn't were never seen again. As weeks passed, the gang began operating like a corporation. Every sector had a captain. Every member had a task. Revenue was recorded, meetings were held, and punishments were swift. Meanwhile, law enforcement struggled to even understand what they were dealing with. There were no obvious patterns, no loose ends, no snitches. The media barely covered the Vultures because they left behind no spectacle. But behind the scenes, their network was growing like a tumor. Quietly, invisibly. In a span of 6 months, the Crimson Vultures controlled most of East Detroit's underground economy. They infiltrated auto repair shops, used car lots, and construction businesses. They hid their money in plain sight, investing in properties and shell companies. Every move was protected by layers of silence and loyalty. As the gang's influence grew, so did its secrets. Silas had plans far beyond Detroit, and with his 2 lieutenants by his side, there was little that stood in his way. The city was only the beginning. As the Crimson Vultures solidified their hold over Detroit, Silas McRae set his eyes beyond the city's broken skyline. Control of local turf wasn't enough. He wanted reach, influence, and long-term survival. The local economy of drugs and weapons was profitable, but it was unstable, easily disrupted by police, rival crews, or internal greed. Silas needed a pipeline that extended beyond state lines, a route that would guarantee supply and security. That's when the Vultures quietly forged an alliance with one of Mexico's most violent drug syndicates, El Clan del Fuego. The arrangement was mutually beneficial. The cartel needed a northern distributor with low visibility and high discipline. The Vultures needed a steady stream of narcotics and connections to international arms dealers. Silas assigned Dante Holloway to lead this operation. With his natural charisma and knowledge of smuggling routes, Dante became the gang's invisible hand, coordinating shipments that moved across borders without triggering alerts. Cargo was labeled as auto parts, electronics, or building materials, all moved through legitimate businesses the gang now controlled. The operation was seamless. Trucks left warehouses in Juarez, crossed into Texas, and by the time they reached Michigan, they were indistinguishable from regular industrial deliveries. Ramona crews managed distribution with clinical precision. Each batch was broken down and handed off to crews operating in Detroit, Chicago, Cleveland, and even parts of New Jersey. The Crimson Vultures weren't a local gang anymore. They were becoming a national network. Silas enforced rules that made betrayal nearly impossible. Every transaction was watched, every handler was tracked. Disobedience was met with quiet removal. Those suspected of theft or leakage were erased without warning. Yet, even with his tight grip, cracks began to form. Ramona began noticing discrepancies in Dante's accounts. Small at first, missing inventory, slightly altered routing numbers, cash not matching ledgers. At first, she thought it was a clerical mistake. But Ramona was thorough. She didn't confront Dante. Instead, she started her own investigation. She tracked ghost shipments, trucks that never arrived but were marked delivered. She followed shell companies tied to Dante's name. She discovered offshore accounts collecting silent revenue from fake drop points. Dante was stealing from the Vultures, and worse, he was using the gang's routes to build something of his own. While Ramona collected evidence, Dante was moving fast. He recruited quietly, picking loyal soldiers from within the gang who owed more to him than to Silas. He planted false intel to misdirect Ramona and worked on creating his own crew, operating out of Kansas City. He called them the Black Serpents, a name no one had heard yet, but soon would. Outside this brewing civil war, law enforcement remained blind. The gang operated too cleanly, but one analyst in the DEA, Kendall Rosner, started noticing patterns no one else did. Shipments labeled under the same vendor ID kept popping up along major interstates. They followed no traditional smuggling paths, but moved like commercial freight. Rosner grew suspicious. He cross-referenced the vendor ID with real estate ownership records in Detroit and found several links to small, newly incorporated LLCs. All were owned by one parent shell company, an entity registered under a false identity. But something felt off. His instincts told him this was a front for something much bigger. Digging deeper, Rosner made a startling discovery. 2 years earlier, his younger brother had disappeared while working as a mechanic in a Detroit body shop. That shop, he now realized, was one of the Vultures' earliest fronts. The timing wasn't coincidence. Now, the case wasn't just professional, it was personal. Rosner chose not to alert his team. He needed more proof, more connections. But he had no idea that the Vultures were already watching the DEA, and that his name had quietly landed on their radar. The machine Silas built was beginning to turn in on itself, and no one, inside or outside, was safe anymore. Ramona Cruz had always trusted her instincts, and now they told her the threat wasn't outside. It was within. Dante, Smoke, Holloway had crossed a line. She had gathered enough to confirm his betrayal, yet she remained silent. Confronting him directly was a risk. If he had loyal men hidden within the ranks, she could be walking into a trap. Instead, she used the silence to her advantage. She started feeding him false numbers, altered drop schedules, and dummy warehouse locations. Then she waited to see who would bite. Within weeks, one of those fake sites was raided. The attackers were fast, professional, and brutal. No drugs were stored there, just cameras. Ramona reviewed the footage frame by frame. Though the men wore masks, one detail stood out: a tattoo on the back of the neck of one of the gunmen. A black serpent fanged and coiled. Dante had made his move. He was no longer hiding. He had declared war. Silas McRae responded immediately. His first order was to lock down all routes and freeze all non-essential operations. But it was too late. The Black Serpents had already spread across Missouri, Kansas, and parts of Illinois. They weren't a splinter cell. They were a fully formed rival organization. And they had help. Cartel shipments were being redirected, new alliances were being formed, and insiders were flipping sides faster than anyone could track. Within a month, the streets of 3 major cities were in chaos. Gunfire erupted in open daylight. Drive-bys turned into fire bombings. Entire neighborhoods were caught in the crossfire. Civilians were caught between warring gangs, and police departments across state lines were overwhelmed. But no one in the public knew who was behind it. The Crimson Vultures had always worked in the shadows. Now, their name was being dragged into the light, and Silas knew the longer it stayed there, the more vulnerable he became. Ramona's role grew more critical. She coordinated cleanups, restructured security, and began quietly eliminating suspected traitors, but even she couldn't be everywhere. The Black Serpents were unpredictable, more reckless than the Vultures had ever been. Unlike Silas's methods, Dante's approach relied on chaos. He believed fear and brutality were more effective than structure and rules. His followers were more like zealots than soldiers. They obeyed without hesitation and killed without remorse. While the streets burned, DEA analyst Kendall Rosner worked quietly in the background. His research had led him to connections between the Crimson Vultures and the cartel, and now he was seeing signs of division. He traced recent attacks to regions that had once been solidly under Vulture control. That meant either law enforcement was finally disrupting their system, or something was happening inside. To confirm his theory, Rosner reached out to the last person connected to the Vultures who might still be alive and willing to talk: Ezekiel, Ghost, Kane. Ghost had once been one of Silas's most trusted men. Then, without warning, he had disappeared after a failed operation in Pittsburgh. Most assumed he had been killed, but Rosner found him hiding in Utah, living under a fake name. It took weeks of tracking, dead-end addresses, and surveillance. When Rosner finally approached him, Ghost didn't run. He listened, and then he agreed. Ghost had no loyalty left to Silas or the Vultures, but he had unfinished business, especially with Dante. He had trained him, watched him rise, and he had warned Silas once about his ambition. Now, with Rosner offering a chance at revenge and redemption, Ghost returned to the shadows to ready enter the deadly game he once escaped. The gang war was no longer just a power struggle. It was personal, with trust fractured, alliances crumbling, and old ghosts rising from the dead. The Crimson Vultures were facing a threat unlike any before. One of their own, now fully evolved into a ruthless enemy. Silas McRae was no stranger to betrayal, but this time it struck deeper than before. Dante Holloway's defection wasn't just a challenge to his authority. It was an attempt to erase everything he had built. As the Black Serpents unleashed coordinated attacks across the Midwest, Silas was forced to retreat into secrecy. He moved his base of operations to an abandoned chemical plant on the outskirts of Toledo, a location only a handful of people knew. From there, he began dismantling what remained of the Vultures' external networks, cutting ties with old contacts, and reducing public activity. But he wasn't giving up. He was planning something final. Ramona Cruz remained his closest advisor. She had proven her loyalty through the storm, and Silas relied on her instincts now more than ever. Together, they identified key Serpent operatives embedded within their former strongholds. Names were listed. Orders were issued. Ramona's team carried out precision hits, quiet, clinical, and efficient. The body count climbed, but it barely slowed Dante's momentum. The Black Serpents didn't fear death. They welcomed it, using it as a tool to instill fear and seize power. What made them dangerous wasn't their numbers, but their unpredictability. At the same time, Kendall Rosner and Ghost continued their infiltration. Ghost, once presumed dead, used his knowledge of old Vulture safehouses and supply caches to navigate through the underground maze of gang infrastructure. They collected evidence, shipping manifests, money laundering trails, weapons purchase orders, and passed them on to a small, trusted contact within the Bureau. It was enough to initiate an internal investigation into organized crime activity connected to a dozen cities. But one document changed everything. Tucked in a locked drawer in a Chicago front company was a binder containing architectural blueprints, chemical analysis sheets, and encrypted instructions. It wasn't about drugs or weapons. It was a plan for an attack. A high-risk, high-impact assault on a federal facility in Virginia, home to a classified DEA archive. The documents included fake credentials, schedules of agent rotations, and maps of interior corridors. The operation was meant to destroy digital and physical records of Vulture and cartel activity. A full wipe of evidence that could implicate high-ranking allies in law enforcement and politics. Rosner immediately transmitted the data to his superiors. The Bureau responded by issuing a silent nationwide alert, placing the Crimson Vultures under maximum surveillance. But they were too late. Silas had already activated the mission. The attack was scheduled in 5 days. Ghost insisted on intercepting it himself. He knew how Silas thought. He could anticipate his fallback plans, his escape routes, his methods of communication. He proposed one solution: find Silas before the attack and shut it down at the source. Ramona, already sensing that her time with the gang was running out, took a risk. She contacted Ghost directly and gave him the last known location of Silas, an isolated private airstrip outside Erie, Pennsylvania. When she arrived there alone, the air was tense. The silence of the open field was broken only by the low hum of an idle propeller plane. Silas stepped out of a hangar, holding a briefcase. He looked older, tired. He didn't raise a weapon. He offered Ramona a way out, a place beside him, far from the gang war and the chaos. She said nothing. A single shot rang out from the tree line. Silas dropped instantly. Ghost emerged from the shadows, lowering his rifle. Ramona stood still, watching her former leader bleed out in the grass. There were no final words, no last-minute confessions, just the quiet collapse of the man who once ruled the streets. The attack was called off. Without Silas, the mission disintegrated. The Crimson Vultures lost their direction. But the war wasn't over. In cities across the country, the Black Serpents continued to grow, feeding off the vacuum of power and spreading deeper into the nation's underworld. One leader had fallen, but a darker one remained. Silas McRae was dead, but his death did not bring peace. It only opened a void, a space that begged to be filled by something even more dangerous. With the Crimson Vultures decapitated and scattered, the Black Serpents surged forward. Led by Dante Holloway, now known simply as King Serpent, they launched a rapid and merciless expansion campaign. Territories that had once belonged to the Vultures fell in days. Cities that had resisted for years now bent under Dante's new regime. Unlike Silas, who ruled with structure and order, Dante thrived on fear and chaos. His leadership didn't come from loyalty. It came from dominance. He recruited anyone willing to kill, regardless of background or skill. The Serpents grew into a cult-like army, their signature black serpent tattoos showing up on faces, hands, and necks across neighborhoods once considered untouchable. Drive-by shootings became daily news. Public executions were filmed and leaked online as warnings. Entire communities fell under an unspoken ruling: obey or disappear. Law enforcement was overwhelmed. The Bureau scrambled to respond but couldn't keep up with the Serpents' pace. Kendall Rosner, though hailed as a hero for exposing the Vultures, was haunted by the unintended consequences of Silas's fall. He had removed a tyrant, but in doing so, unleashed something far worse. The streets weren't safer. They were soaked in more blood than ever before. Ramona Cruz vanished after Silas's death. Some believed she had been killed in retaliation. Others claimed she had joined the Serpents. But the truth was quieter. She had gone underground, cutting all ties to the gang world. She lived in silence, monitoring news feeds and gang activity from a motel outside Buffalo. Though she had left the battlefield, her mind remained trapped in it. She watched as Dante turned everything she had once helped build into a machine of destruction. The discipline and structure she had maintained was now replaced with raw savagery. Ezekiel, Ghost, Kane too, went off the grid. After taking down Silas, he considered his mission complete. But as reports of the Serpent's brutality spread, he couldn't ignore the consequences. Ghost began gathering intel again, not for law enforcement, but for himself. Quietly, he started reaching out to former Vultures, men and women who had fled rather than submit to Dante's rule. They were scattered, broken, and in hiding. But they still had one thing: hatred for what the gang world had become. Within months, Ghost began forming a new network. Not a gang, an army. Something different. A resistance. No name, no cores, no symbols. Just small cells acting independently, hitting Serpent stash houses, disrupting their supply chains, and freeing neighborhoods trapped under their control. It wasn't a war. It was sabotage, and it worked. But Dante wasn't blind. He noticed the disruptions and ordered immediate retaliation. Entire blocks were burned. Civilians were accused of hiding former Vultures and executed in front of their families. The Resistance's actions triggered brutal crackdowns. The Serpents didn't care about strategy. They cared about domination. As the year came to a close, the United States faced a new reality. Street gangs were no longer small-time operations. They were organized, globalized, and expanding. The fall of the Crimson Vultures hadn't ended the nightmare. It had merely changed its face. Dante's name was now whispered in cities from coast to coast. His serpents slithered into every corner, poisoning whatever they touched. In the end, America hadn't destroyed its most powerful street gang. It had simply traded one evil for another. And in the shadows, Ghost and his nameless network prepared for what would come next. The war for the streets wasn't over. It had only evolved.